Hi, everybody. Welcome to my treats talk. Let's see. So Peter wanted me to go through some things because he's going to be, I think, a little bit late. But he wanted me to remind you that treats talks are presented by BSAP, which I think still might stand for Bioethics and Subject Advocacy Program, which is a part of the Indiana CTSI. It may also stand for something else now. These are approximately 30-minute introductions to key topics in research ethics, especially research ethics in regards to translational medicine. They're usually live, and some people are live. Hello, thank you for being there in person. Today, I was under the impression that it was only going to be streamed online. So usually it'll be both, but it's certainly available online, and you can check up on this in a couple of days to rewatch if you want, or if you miss anything to come back to it. Both available on the archive on our center's webpage, and then also it'll be up on YouTube for viewing later as well. So a quick roadmap of what I'm going to discuss today. First, I'll give you a brief introduction since Peter isn't here to do that. Then we'll talk about the distinction between research and clinical care. And then I'll talk about the challenges that individuals face when they're acting both as clinicians and as researchers. Then I'll turn to how we can ameliorate the issues that arise from kind of wearing these two hats, is the way that we phrased it. And then actually look at some of the benefits of wearing two hats. And then at close, we'll talk about a case study from my previous research, which is actually why I was asked to do this talk on the kinds of issues that clinicians I've worked with faced in real life when also doing research with patients of theirs. Okay, so quick, who am I? My name is Colin Halverson. I'm a researcher at the Center for Bioethics. I'm also faculty in the medical school. I've got on the screen three, I think, relatively representative papers that I've published recently. And I have these three papers up specifically because I think they showcase my background, which becomes relevant to today's talk. So I have a Ph.D. in medical and linguistic anthropology from the University of Chicago. And so my background, initially, my training was that. I ended up doing a fellowship in clinical medical ethics at Chicago, and then I did my postdoctoral fellowship in the Center for Bioethics at Vanderbilt University, which also becomes relevant at the end of the talk for the case. So here you can kind of see the scope of research that I've conducted. Everything from much more medically focused quantitative work on comorbidity, some very philosophical stuff on genetic essentialism, and then this kind of fun paper that just came out, I think last week or 2 weeks ago, about emoji, where I actually got to dive into some legitimate linguistics, which was also very fun. So in the Belmont report, which came out in 1987, which I know that Dr. Schwartz talked about in his last treats talk. So some of this is going to be retreading ground. I appreciate your tolerance of that, but all of this is obviously very relevant to my topic as well. So the Belmont report in 1987, which was the culmination of a lot of movement in American bioethics for the preceding 40 years, 50 years. And it noted what it described as segregation model, a strong ethical and legal distinction between the domains of therapy and research. Here on the screen, you can see a table that describes the differences. I'm going to argue on the next slide that there are really important differences between these two domains, and that there is rationale to keep these things distinct, at least nominally, in your own work and practice. But we'll also see that this is probably fairly obviously complicated, especially in the contemporary practice of medicine. So on the side of therapy, we talk about patients. On the side of research, we talk about participants. I note that in particular because I promise I will slip between those two accidentally. In writing, I think this is very important, though, because it does present to the readers clear distinctions about who is being discussed. The goal of therapy or of clinical care is really the care of the individual patient. This is not the goal of research, and this is, I think, the primary source of the ethical conflicts that arise for individuals who wear both hats, as we've been saying. The goal of research is to produce generalizable knowledge about how the world is. And so it's not always the case that research benefits the individual. And in fact, you're generally required to tell candidates for research that they will not benefit personally, or will not necessarily benefit personally. Other things to note: therapy, you have a standard of care as kind of your threshold for what you can and cannot do. There are all kinds of other things that become incumbent on a researcher to decide what will make the most scientifically valid endeavors to produce new knowledge. Then also with oversight therapy, you have professional guidelines, malpractice, a bunch of very different things from research. And here I mentioned IRB, your funders, but also CLIA, which again will become important for the case. And so for those of you who don't know, CLIA is an authority that certifies labs as being able to return scientifically valid results to participants. Okay, so one of the primary reasons for this strong distinction, the segregation model proposed by the Belmont Report, is that the goals and duties of therapy versus research are what many scholars consider to be non-commensurate. Paul Applebaum wrote this paper in 2012, which has become kind of a cornerstone for a lot of how we've thought about this. I think this actually may be a later one of his articles, because I'm pretty sure I read this when I was fresh to grad school in 2011. So in any case, this is Paul Applebaum's concept. The idea of therapeutic misconception is that patients, IRB staff, and we, as we'll discuss later, as clinicians, may not understand the differences between timelines, expectations, and the purposes as they differ between therapy and clinical care. The primary concern for Applebaum and co-authors is that patients may choose to enroll in research because they misunderstand, as we've discussed just a moment ago, the goals of research as to be directly related to their own personal benefit. So that's what it means when we say that there's a confusion between goals. This obviously has implications for informed consent. If patients don't understand that they will not personally benefit or are not in the intended beneficiaries of research, this can really skew their ability to give valid informed consent, because they clearly don't understand what the benefits, and then thus also won't be able to weigh the risks and benefits appropriately. This also complicates the voluntariness in recruitment and retainment as well. You can imagine cases in which participants, believing themselves to be patients, might stick around for something that they consider to be burdensome or potentially dangerous for a much longer time if they don't understand that they may personally never actually benefit from the research itself. All right, so as I mentioned, and as Peter talked about at length in his Treats talk, the segregation model is all too tidy for clear ethical description of how to best to behave in contemporary biomedicine. Peter talked in his presentation about learning healthcare systems. If you're interested, I think you can certainly go back and watch that. I hope that's relatively clear how the what we call interdigitation, or the mixing between research and clinical care, obviously makes a strong distinction between these domains untenable. But we also have much older versions of this mixing, this role mixing, that complicates ethics as well. Surgery, for example, is often described as necessarily an experiment or experimentational. And clinical trials are kind of even thought of as a standard of care in many later stages in oncology. This is kind of expected for many patients, that they will also be enrolled in research. And if you ask oncologists about that enrollment, you'll probably learn that they also think that the reason for enrolling is the potential benefit of the individual patient. None of this is obviously wrong. I think all of that is very interesting, and it underscores how much the world of medicine has changed, or at least the way that we think about medicine, and especially ethics in medicine, since 1987. All right, so here's some ethical challenges facing individuals who wear both hats, meaning that they both perform as researchers and as clinicians. All of these conflicts become particularly noteworthy when the researcher is also enrolling their own patients from their own clinic. However, I think all of these challenges are faced by researchers, whether or not they're recruiting their own patients, if they also understand themselves in other moments in their lives to be working towards the betterment of individuals. So the first is conflict of interest. I think most obviously people will think of finances when they hear conflict of interest. So if you are a researcher working for a company in which you have monetary investments, probably it's pretty clear how those kinds of biases or ulterior motivations might affect your willingness to recruit your own patients. But conflict of interest also obtains in things as kind of mundane or as everyday as professional advancement. So you think of the phrase publish or perish. There's a strong pressure for medical faculty to constantly be publishing new results, often positive results. And this may also affect a clinician or a researcher's willingness and the way in which they recruit patients from their clinic or other clinics. Let's see, select specific patients. Clinicians may also select specific patients to become participants based on their foreknowledge of that participant or their already established relationship with that patient. And they may also be affected by the desire to reach a specific outcome. This is related to the conflict of interest point as well. Consent and patient autonomy. So the other thing that becomes complicated, not so much from the perspective of the clinicians, but on the perspective of the patient, so thinking back to therapeutic misconception, is that it may be tricky to make sure that the patient understands that they have the ability to decline participating in a research study, and that participation is voluntary. And this is why IRBs will generally require you to remind participants or candidates for participation that their decision whether or not to participate will not affect their health care in any way, either positively or negatively. Confidentiality and privacy. I think this one's kind of more interesting, or maybe less obvious. So if you're a clinician, you have access to information about your own patients in a way that you wouldn't necessarily have as a researcher. So if you have a long established relationship with a patient, or even if you just had a conversation with the patient in clinic before they enrolled in research. These two sets of data about the patient should be kept separate. And that means not just in your own mind, but also literally physically. So if you think about just like the files in Excel files, but also files in cabinets, for instance. The other challenge faced by individuals wearing two hats is trying to maintain an understanding of whose best interests you're actually pursuing at any given time. So when you're wearing your clinician hat, the best interest obviously is the patient. As we'll see in the case, this becomes very complicated when you switch roles and you become the researcher, and the best interest isn't necessarily that individual anymore. This, as Dr. Schwartz discussed in his talk, puts a restraint on clinicians' abilities to make decisions for their own patients, which can be an ethical challenge, or it can cause moral distress. But it can also be a challenge for patients who may find themselves placed in a placebo arm or in an arm that they would not otherwise have selected for themselves. All of this has an impact on trust. So maintaining trust in therapeutic alliance also can become a challenge when you're constantly flipping between your two roles. For instance, if something goes wrong in the research, or as I just mentioned, the patient is assigned to an arm that they would not otherwise have chosen for themselves, that may permanently damage your relationship as a clinician to that patient or to that participant as your patient. All right, and as promised, we've got some best practice recommendations. Setting clear boundaries is obviously the most practical and probably most impactful thing you can do. And so what this means is, one, being transparent with your participants, often in the informed consent, being very clear, for instance, saying that it's a voluntary decision, it won't impact their healthcare, but also making clear that your role as a researcher is distinct from your role as a clinician, and that there's going to be all kinds of scientific reasons that you have to follow other goals than the goals that you have as a clinician for them. You also should, at this point, obviously disclose any kinds of conflicts of interest, and how you do that is up to you. Conflict of interest that's financial is probably much more obvious, but understanding and thinking critically about how your conflict of interest as a scholar or as faculty with pressures to publish, pressures to get grants, etc., should also be disclosed at that time. As I mentioned, my training and background is as an anthropologist. And so the other thing that I think is very interesting in terms of best practices is symbolic dimension to how you differentiate your two roles. These might seem kind of facile or overly simplistic, but I think the actual symbolic work that some of these suggestions do is really worthwhile. So for instance, basic rituals like attention to clothing. Are you wearing your white coat when you're trying to recruit someone to a research program? Are you wearing your stethoscope? These kinds of things can confuse patients of yours, make you think that your role in enrolling them, is going to have the same goals as clinical care when it does not. Other things like physical space. Are you trying to recruit patients in clinic, in the waiting room? All of these things also clearly have a symbolic dimension to them, where the patients have different expectations than they would if you were calling them at home, or if you were trying to recruit them off the street, etc. You might also consider, even though obviously recruiting from clinic is easier, you might consider recruiting outside of clinic if you feel like the symbolic dimension of this is too great for patients to understand that they're being addressed as participants. Let's see. You might also consider delegating recruitment to others on your team who are not actively a part of the individual's clinical care. And if you are all clinicians, or you all feel like you're too closely involved with the healthcare establishment, you might even seek external collaboration for that portion of the research. I've been talking a lot about recruitment, and I should also note that obviously all of this does not just apply to the early moments of the research project, but also if you're thinking about doing anything longitudinal or doing interviews, how you present and who presents in front of the participants also obviously has a symbolic impact on how their decision-making process, how they're participating, and their willingness to continue to participate. As I mentioned on the last slide, another symbolic thing that you can do is to maintain a distinction between clinical and research records, to keep them separate. So if you know something about a patient, or you have an Excel spreadsheet, or if you have a red cap following a group of individuals as patients, that information, without explicit consent or without other kinds of permissions from the IRB, for instance, should not be used or should not be consulted for the research portion of your career. You should make sure that you discuss your dual role with the IRB, but you can also consider other forms of external supervision. This could just be another researcher or another clinician who's not involved in the research, or and simultaneously not involved in these individuals' care. But you can also call BSAP, the Bioethics Subject Advocacy program that we were just discussing, that this presentation is a part of. And so this is not just to satisfy regulations that may be overseen by the IRB, but to also try to do the best, most ethical research possible. See, and of course there are numerous benefits to wearing two hats as well. The first of which is that the integration of evidence-based medicine into patient-centered care, or what Mayo Clinic has called individualized medicine, obviously has immediate impact on the individual participants. So that's one positive. Even if it's not benefiting them as patients, they may still experience some benefits downstream from the research, but it also benefits the population of which they're a member much more immediately. And for the researcher, him or herself, it provides continuous professional development and embeds the researcher, or embeds the clinician rather, in the constant flux of medical progress. So it kind of forces you to keep up with the science, which is also obviously beneficial to your patients when you're wearing your clinician hat, but also beneficial to you both as a clinician and also most obviously as a researcher. And there's also more tenuously, you can say that this improves, this has at least the potential to improve recruitment. I think there's an important distinction to be made between trust and trustworthiness, by which I mean, so recruitment could be improved because your patients already have an established relationship with you. Presumably, if they've continued to see you, they trust you. They see you as trustworthy, and then they're more likely to accede to your wishes to participate in research. Obviously, as we've discussed before, they may also feel undue pressures to participate in research that you suggest to them. That part is obviously unethical. Using the patient's trust in you to recruit is not necessarily ethical, but it certainly can be. You just have to think really critically about your trust in the research that's being done as well before recommending it. All right, and then let's turn to the case study. So back when I was a postdoc at Vanderbilt, I was involved in Emerge 3, and I helped to run the ethics portion of that at Vanderbilt. eMERGE 3 is the Electronic Medical Records and Genomics Network. It spanned the entire country. I think there were maybe 10 to 13 sites in eMERGE 3. They included everything from CHOP to Mayo to Harvard to Kaiser, and obviously Vanderbilt as well. If you're interested in this study, I've got the article up here that I'll be talking about. But the purpose of eMERGE 3 was to conduct genetic testing on patients from all of these different places, and then should try to upload the genetic test results into their EHR and see whatever kinds of challenges you might encounter. Let's see. So one of the things that became an immediate obvious problem was there were some types of results that clinicians, researchers, per IRB, per the protocol that was initially developed, were technically not allowed to return to participants. These are types of results that, had they been acting only as clinicians, would obviously have been returned to the individuals who would have then been serving as patients. But because of IRB protocols and because of the scientific structure and the goals of the project, that was not possible. So we saw in our interviews that we conducted with the researchers at these different sites a significant amount of moral distress arising from their inability to return results that they consider to be clinically relevant. If you're interested, there's a phrase called interdigitation that's been used by Susan Wolf in 2018 to describe this kind of interstitial or interweaving of research and therapy in these translational spaces. So how much can you explain? Okay, right, sorry. So they have these potentially clinically relevant results, and it was causing so much distress that we ended up having regular meetings to discuss how can we get these results back to patients or to participants, despite the fact that this was technically not allowed. The primary way that many of the sites decided to deal with this issue was to either entirely redo their protocol, or to reconsent patients under, a new version of the protocol in which the return results was allowed. This became convoluted because at recontact, you have to describe to the participant why they might want to get results back now, even though they were told initially that they never would be able to, without disclosing what the result was. And so you've got a tightrope walk of, do you tell too much and risk kind of pressuring the patient or the participant to accede to the return results? Or do you err on the other side and perhaps be too circumspect, and then the participant isn't interested in receiving the results because they don't sound important enough? So yeah, and you also have to think about realistically portraying the potential medical importance of the results, because this is, again, research. This was conducted, as I mentioned before, under a CLIA protocol. So it's not the same thing as getting these results done for clinical purposes. And so, like I mentioned, a lot of individuals, a lot of researchers decided to go this route, where they undertook enormous labors to recontact. And again, and I don't think I mentioned this, but some of the results took years to get back. So imagine having to scrounge up new phone numbers, new addresses, new email addresses for hundreds and hundreds of participants from across the country so that you can return these kinds of results. The amount of labor that went into this was kind of extraordinary. And it's for that reason that we came up with this term clinical impulse, which we can get kind of technical if people are interested in the ethics behind this. But the idea that sometimes wearing these two hats can be so morally troubling that researchers are willing to undertake kind of heroic measures in order to circumvent the research aspect of their professional job, if that makes sense. So if people are interested, here's some questions that I think are worth considering if you're wearing two hats. There's in ethics, there's a phrase called supererogation. So if you think that you could have things that are considered morally acceptable, morally unacceptable, and then things that are supererogative, which are kind of beyond the call of duty. So these are things that are good to do, but they're not necessary. So you're not doing anything wrong if you don't take this kind of heroic step, but you are doing something better by taking the heroic step. And so I think we've got plenty of time for questions. I tried to keep this short because I was running long yesterday, but I am happy to kind of count in some more of these kinds of philosophical questions, or we can talk practically too.
Oh, who's going to be first? Always me. No, anybody, really. I'm just going to fill up the time if somebody formulates their question. First of all, great to see everybody. Sorry I couldn't be on before. I heard most of everything. Hey, Colin, I was going to ask you a question. First, I was going to say thank you for giving a treats talk that used the word supererogative. Very, very important and appreciated. A philosopher's term. In the literature on increasing diversity in research, sometimes the research points to being asked by a trusted individual as being key to being successful in recruiting members of previously underrepresented populations. So would you say you're looking at this topic of wearing two hats makes you confident in this as a good way forward, or as problematic? I did like what you said about that I'm going to boil it down and tell me if it's right. It's okay to take advantage of trust in order to encourage people to join a study, as long as you believe that study is being done in a trustworthy fashion and is a reasonable choice, maybe.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I think that wearing two hats is necessarily a different kind of challenge and includes probably more challenges than wearing only one hat. But I also think that it's the only way forward. I think this is more and more what medicine is going to look like. And I also think medicine is going to look, excuse me, better for it. And I will also say, in terms of minoritized or otherwise marginalized communities, there's all kinds of extra sensitivities that you have to consider, especially in the role of trust, in recruitment, in retention, et cetera. But you also should probably be thinking critically about the role of research and how that, so like kind of the reverse, I guess is what I'm trying to say. So it doesn't just impact the research side, but it also impacts being known as a researcher will impact your ability to maintain a therapeutic alliance with your patients as well. Nick?
Hi, Colin. I was wondering if you could return to the previous slide on the return of individual results to participants. So I guess my question is this, where do you stand on the fact that the researchers wanted to change the protocols just to satisfy their, I guess, personal need to return those results?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I don't know exactly which slide you were referring to. Is it this one maybe?
I think it was the previous one, but it's okay.
Yeah, so I think I do think it's commendable. That's why I called it supererogatory. I do think it speaks very highly to them as clinicians, I think. But as I promised in the beginning, despite all of the changes that we've seen in medicine, and despite all of the obvious shortcomings of having the segregation model try to maintain in translational spaces, I do think that there are real differences in the goals and the legitimate goals of both these two domains. So I think that, for instance, the amount of work that they did was only possible because they had enough money to do it, that they came from well-resourced institutions, and that they weren't worried that the funding was going to pull if they took too long in returning results or whatever, and that they weren't worried that returning those specific results was going to compromise the scientific project as a whole. I think all of those are really legitimate worries. And one of the benefits of having the two domains kept separate is that sometimes I think the clinical impulse or trying to provide individual care can be chilling on otherwise necessary, or at least beneficial at a population level research project.
Thank you.
Well, we're maybe getting near the end here, but actually I see a room full of people, and I'm guessing in that room of excellent researchers and research assistants. I wonder if, and Pierce has got something. Pierce, you're first, but then it's over to the room labeled Karen Schmidt.
Yeah, hi, Colin. I just had a thought about, do you think there's an urban-rural divide between doctors that are researching and doctors that aren't? It seems that might be the case because of research institutions mainly being in cities. I don't know, but I just wonder the effects upon, what the research population is, or, if there's pros to that, then rural people might not have access to that as much, but I just want to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I think that's definitely true. I think there's, this is maybe one of the less talked about forms of marginalization from both medical care and medical research, is the distinction between rural and urban. There, I think very interestingly, has been this nationwide program called All of Us, which is specifically meant to, this is one of the things that was going on while I was doing the eMERGE research. It's meant to capture not just, I think, the earlier recognized forms of marginalized communities, but also to make active efforts to go out into rural communities. But you face similar problems in those communities as well in research recruitment, as you do in any kind of communities where you don't have an active research presence, which is separate from saying that there's historical reasons for reticence. But I've definitely had friends who've gone out into rural communities to try to recruit and have had kind of incredible issues due to the same trustworthiness problems that we discussed a moment ago.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, I guess if the room does not want to, they are coming off mute. They have agreed to my pressure.
Hold on one second. Okay. I'm feeling pressure to make a comment or think of something. So my non-philosophical background will just go to the more everyday, my experience and a little the concern and frustration I have about some of the ads you hear on TV or radio or whatever, YouTube. Yes, it's community. Is it community now that's advertising the another partnership with MD Anderson? And now you can be, afforded all of these options now, clinical trials. And I think St. Francis now, someone's just recently partnered with Mayo. Now you can be, have the opportunity for all of these clinical trials. And again, back to your earlier comment, the distinction between the two is not being held by the marketing out here. And I've got to believe it's the health systems that are paying the big bucks for these marketers to provide this sort of information to the masses out there. Thoughts on that, Colin, and anybody else?
Thank you, Karen. Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I think it is, I would say, relatively disturbing to see that kind of advertisement. If you go to other countries, you don't see the same kind of a thing because of the structure of the healthcare system. The need to continuously recruit participants to these studies is obviously not just scientific, right? There's real financial incentives for some of these larger scale or institutional scale studies too. And that's obviously unfortunate and goes into the idea of the conflict of interest. And I do think also, you think about when I was at Mayo Clinic, there was this wonderful story of like one of the earlier classes of med students there made had a small number of mugs that said Mayo on them made just for the students, like just for that class. And then the dean found out or someone found out. And Mayo at that time was so opposed to any of this kind of advertising, branding, whatever, that they had all of them destroyed except for one. And I won't say who has the one, but there is one that still exists. And that was just such a different time period. And you contrast that with today when Mayo Clinic owns, I forget what it is, or at least partially owns the Lynx sports team. And, and Mayo is emblazoned on everything. And there's all kinds of, healthcare systems are constantly advertising themselves in exactly this kind of a way. And I do think that has a degradatory effect on any kind of understanding about what is the institution, what is the research, what is the clinical care.
Thank you for that, Colin.
And I'm giving myself a pat on the back for forcing the room to ask a question. Karen, that was an excellent question. And I think it's true, right, that the idea of wearing two hats and being clear and reflective on the different roles is destroyed, right? It's very hard to be a clinician in that setting where there's been an advertisement trying to it. I will say one more thing before we go to Mary, which is that at the highest levels of leadership, I know they are very interested in getting access to clinical trials for patients. In the rooms I'm in, I believe that is motivated by this is what patients want at some stage in their care when there's nothing else approved to offer. They'd like to be able to offer clinical trials. So that's the positive side of it, right? The supererogatory side of I want to make sure people have access to experimental treatment. But again, it's still treatment. It's still research. It's not treatment. And that has to be clear. And that raises all the issues you've talked about today, Colin. I love it. And Mary is on.
Thanks. So Colin, as I was listening, particularly around the genetic testing part, I was really struck by the fact that access to research really plays into this very positivist view within American medicine, where although like philosophers will say not doing is morally equivalent to doing, like you're making a choice either way, on a patient level, like not doing feels very different than doing. And there's a big impulse to do if you can do. In pediatrics where I live, it's even revved up to a higher level because people are making a decision for someone else. And so I worry about the human cost of this sort of push towards research and tech where, you know, for instance, in children's cancer, would it make more sense for the young person to be sort of legitimately offered comfort care and home care rather than experimental therapy that will keep them in the hospital and have them most likely die in the hospital? And so we think about there's like this human cost about this positivist and non-positive stuff. And then there's like a bigger health system, like dollars and cents cost, where when we think about like high value versus low value healthcare, like we do a lot of like low value healthcare that's really expensive and has like limited effects. And we like, there's like high value stuff that we don't actually do really well. Like we don't vaccinate well. We don't even vaccinate children with like the MMR well, let alone like more controversial vaccines. So I was wondering if you could comment on those two pieces that, you know, as you spoke, particularly about your role in when you were doing your postdoc, you know, if you have examples from that. And I'm parked, but I'm going to turn off my camera.
Sure. Thank you very much. Nice to see you, Mary. Two great questions. So I guess kind of an example from my world in response to the first question, one of the things that I saw when I was doing my doctorate in oncology was the big question of when genetic testing was really warranted. And genetic testing at that point, at least, was typically done on a research protocol. And there, you know, and I, especially at this moment in my life, really do believe that there's a good, sound clinical reason to just do the genetic testing immediately. But especially at that point, when it was research, it was I think, great ethics conundrum about whether or not it makes sense to have that amount of overlap between clinical care and research. One of the things that made it less useful at that point was there were so few alternatives for chemo or for any kind of intervention that knowing a genotype often did not actually have any kind of impact on clinical care anyway. All it was, you know, really practically speaking, the vast majority of people who enrolled in those research protocols really were only contributing to research. There was no real benefit to them as individuals. I think that's changed quite a bit since 2013 when I started doing that kind of work. It's a decade ago. But it is still, I think that same question could be asked at any point now. Like there's obviously benefit to, at a population level, to, you know, wide scoping recruitment to all kinds of genetics research. Not just, you know, immediate practical benefit in terms of how it affects clinical care for the population, but also we have so, you know, to go back to the all of us, we have a very limited understanding still of the relationship between genotype and phenotype because of the types of people who are generally recruited. So recruiting broader or more broadly obviously has real benefits too. But like I said, I think all of these things are very different from my example at the beginning of, I kind of think like the image you have in your head of clinical trials for oncology patients. I hope that makes sense.
I thought it made sense. And Mary is now not coming back, which I hope she's satisfied. That was a good question. Excellent answer. I wanted to just finish, I guess, unless you have more to say, Colin, about saying this is really wonderful. I think Colin and I both imagined this as being a partner, like he said at the beginning, with a talk that I gave about a month ago on learning healthcare systems. Two different sides, ways to look at the challenge of doing clinical research along with clinical care. One is more about the future developments that are coming in that area, in the learning healthcare system area, and hear about doing it now and probably continuing with these questions. I like what you said. I can't help putting